Okay, so thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for indulging my old school sensibilities. I am afraid I didn't manage a handout, so I'll just be talking. I hope it won't be too boring, and if you nod off, I'll just count that as it being late in the day and not my talk at all. So I'm going to talk about a truly philosophical issue, a truly abstract and conceptual issue, and I do apologize if it's too much philosophy, but I'm sure we can clarify everything later over coffee. That's the best way to do philosophy anyway, over coffee or over beer. So I'm going to talk about experiencing reality alive and on how to discover engaged experience with Whitehead and Bergson. And I've got a little quote I'd like to start with, and it's from Emily Dickinson, and it goes, "To live is so startling, it leaves little time for anything else." What I'm trying to do today is I'm trying to account for an aspect or a type of experience that I will call engaged experience. And this is an aspect of sense experience, so an experience of the external world, quotation marks. And I will attempt to outline how a focus on engaged experience can help us to uncover fundamental features of the world that we are shown in experience and that we usually overlook or disregard. And I will do this by trying to outline that it's actually Whitehead and Bergson who proposed such a focus on engaged experience, and that it is this engaged experience that allowed them to see the world as alive, as dynamic, and as temporal. So there's a direct correlation between engaged experience and discovering reality as a dynamic process. In Bergson, the phenomenon of engaged experience gets treated under the title of intuition, and in Whitehead, it gets treated under the concept of causal efficacy. I will go into the details of those terms later, but just so you know, Bergson talks about intuition and Whitehead talks about causal efficacy. And I will claim that those two ways to talk about experience are actually ways to talk about engaged experience. So before I can explain what I mean by the term engaged experience, of course, I need to tell you what I think experience is. That's already a really daunting task, and Whitehead, for example, said that experience is one of the most deceitful terms in philosophy. So I hope to be able to undeceive people a little bit. We'll see how it goes. So first and foremost, I use the term experience to refer to an immediate perception of whatever is going on in the world. And I contrast this with knowledge, which I take to be a result of a conceptual interpretation or of reflection on experience, be it inner experience or outer experience. So we have experience and knowledge is something quite different. I will focus my investigation on sense experience because I'm interested how engaged experience relates to our perception of the world as dynamic. I'm not interested how engaged experience could show us consciousness or internal phenomena. So I'm just going to leave aside internal experience for now, not because it's not relevant, not because it's not important. It's just not the question that I'm asking. It's not the aspect I'm interested in. So in what I've said about experience so far here, I do not diverge too much from other empiricists. And as an empiricist view as maybe proposed by Locke. Just a quick reminder what Locke proposes. He says that all knowledge stems from experience, either sense experience of outer phenomena or as experience of reflection of inner phenomena. And he says, I quote, "The sensations convey into the mind several distinct perceptions of things according to those various ways wherein those objects affect them." Right? Sense experience is an inner copy, representation, image of something that happens outside. That is the traditional empiricist way of understanding experience. So experience is generally understood as some form of registration. There's some data that gets registered and is somehow synthesized or managed, or something happens to it, and then at the end of this, I have a presentation, a representation of the origin of what gave me that sense experience. And representation is to be understood really broadly construed. I know there are many debates going on, what is representation, whether it's represented. Let's just construe it as broadly as we possibly can and say an empirical understanding of experience, the understanding of experience that informs science, for example, means there's something out there that in some way or other comes into here. And if there is a correspondence between my image or my copy and the world out there, then I've had a proper experience and didn't just imagine things. So this understanding of sense experience is characterized by two aspects. Firstly, it tends to frame experience in terms of sense data or sums of sense data. It's like a little Lego block theory of experience. So you've got little bits and pieces that you can put together to make experience. And secondly, that there is a substantial distinction between inner and outer, and we don't confuse that. So my image in here is it's categorically different from the world out there. In what follows, I will try to show how one-sided this understanding of experience is. But let me make clear, there's nothing wrong with it. It's super successful and super helpful. But it is one-sided and can thus not be applied to each and every question, to each and every instant of investigation of experience. And in what follows, I will use Edmund Husserl, the phenomenologist who was very interested in discovering what actual experience is and how we should understand experience, to show these levels of one-sidedness and maybe help uncover a different way to look at experience and thus uncover engaged experience. So Husserl does not only provide an excellent account of how the world and the mind interact to create experience, but he also begins with at a quite different point. So it doesn't begin with sense data that gets subsumed or synthesized into objects, but he says that if we investigate experience closely, what we actually see isn't just a set of sense data. What we actually see is an object. When we experience things, we experience events, we experience happenings, but we don't experience redness or roundness or those sort of things. Only when we analyze what we're given in experience, and only when we look at it and try to distinguish different aspects, only then do we arrive at these distinct sense data. So that's a secondary step, which we've always confused to be primary. So if we begin our investigation of experience and its contents with qualia or sense data, whatever else people talk about, we have already lost what we actually experience. Actual experience is already lost and unrecoverably lost, Husserl would say. Husserl argues further that we don't just experience objects, but we always experience objects in contexts. An object is never given in isolation. It has a background, for example. Whether we focus on it or not, whenever we experience something, we experience this in relation to a background, to a context against which it appears. And this relation of foreground and background is correlated to my body. The way I look, the way I hold my face, shifts the correlation between background and foreground. When I look at this glass, for example, and I shift my face, the way the foreground and the background relate, the way the object appears in front of a background shifts and changes. So my body is part of the experience, an essential part of the experience. Another example, if I see an apple and I walk toward it, I expect it to become bigger. If it doesn't become bigger, we have a problem. We can deduce that this isn't actually an experience. Something's wrong here. So there's a lot of information and experience connected to my body, my behavior, my movement in the room that we miss out on if we just have an empiricist understanding of experience. So it might, for example, happen that I mistake a very realistic image of that apple with the real apple. But however, as soon as I investigate that experience, even to a small detail, as soon as I try to grasp it or even try to eat it, it'll become quite clear that we made a mistake. how can that happen if it's just a set of sense experiences that follow, one follows the other? This is only possible because my expectation of being able to grasp the apple motivates me to move towards the apple and grasp it, and only thus can I be surprised. So my expectation that there is an apple is part of my experience of surprise when the apple isn't actually there. So I have to retain some of my, I have to project something into my experience, which is always part of my experience. And this expectation that's projected into experience, Husserl calls protension. Only thanks to this expectation can I be surprised. Furthermore, when I arrive at the apple, I have to still have the memory of this expectation to be surprised. If the past weren't connected to my present experience, I still couldn't be surprised. So in order to have this very simple experience of an apple that isn't actually an apple, I need a pretension, an expectation, a retention of memory, a sort of presence of memory, and my orientation of the body for this tiny little everyday experience. And Husserl says every single experience we have has all these levels and layers. And he discovers many, many more. But I'm just trying to point out that there is much more to experience than some sense data out here and some image in here, right? So a close investigation of actual experience shows us that experience involves much more than simply noticing, registering, and representing data. Experience is also a form of connection, of interaction, of understanding through sympathy, of disclosure and engagement, as I tried to describe with Husserl very simply. If we furthermore acknowledge that experience is an actual part of the world, it's not something just inside the mind, as we've just seen, it's something that's interacting with the world to generate experience, that means it is part of the world. Furthermore, we as experiencing beings are part of the world. So to say that experience is somehow not material or somehow not part of the world doesn't seem to quite get at what experience really is. Experience is part of the real world and not beyond it. And if we admit this, then all of a sudden experience becomes an ontological problem. And that's the point where Whitehead and Bergson picked this problem up, when it turns ontological. This understanding of experience as an objective and ontological part of the world undercuts further the traditional distinction in epistemology between inner and outer, between subjective and objective, and seems to render experience an interactive and an objective form of engagement. So I would claim that there are two ways engaged experience is actually engaged. One works on the epistemological level, the level of information and the level of theory of knowledge, and one works on the ontological level, on the level of reality and physics and matter. First, engaged in experience is engaged in actively discovering, as best possible, all sorts of preconceptions that guide our common sense understanding of sense experience. This engagement on the level of epistemology is focused on preventing misinterpretations of what experience is and misinterpretations of specific experiences. So the first level of engagement is trying to uncover what the experience actually is and not what we generally think experience is. And this engagement is a matter of degree. We will never be fully rid of the conceptual framework that shapes the way we think about experience and indirectly shapes experience. But it is worth trying to be as free of them as we possibly can. And this seems to put us in a rather contradictory position that claims that we have to develop an adequate practice of experience before we can experience adequately. So that means that we can't just open our eyes and have perfect experience, and everything's given just as it is, and everything works out the same for everyone else. But that actually experiencing first involves an active intellectual engagement and understanding of experience. good example is that experiences are often colored. Experience can be colored by past experiences, by emotions, by hopes and dreams, and just to separate what actually is there in the experience from what we put into the experience is quite a lot of work. So on the one hand, engaged experience is engaged in the attempt to provide this sort of clarification. And in that sense, it has a lot in common with phenomenology. This is the phenomenological project that's clarify what experience actually is. But there's a fundamental problem with this approach, namely that we are always already experiencing beings, right? So we can't start investigate our experience and then start experiencing. We always are already experiencing beings. So there is no outside of experience from which I could objectively determine, so this is objective experience and this is my coloring. So this is always going to just be a gradual project to be done as well as we possibly can, but never fully fulfilled. So we can only do this haphazardly while we experience. Because there is no before experience for the experiencing beings that we are. But there's a second ontological sense in which engaged experience is engaged. Namely, engaged experience describes an experience that is directly engaged with what is experienced on an ontological level. This is to be thought of as a form of direct touching, direct experience, or direct givenness, an immediate access to what there is, and entering into the ontological object through sympathy. And it is this aspect of engaged experience that Whitehead and Bergson pointed out and worked from, departed from. This is what shaped their thoughts, and this is how their systems were developed, by growing out from this idea that the inner and the outer is not separated, and we have direct access to what there is. So this direct grasping is possible for two reasons. First, because we've minimized the subjective layers in the first step, so we tried to decompose as much of our conceptual and emotional preconceptions to actually let experience appear. And it's secondly possible because on an ontological level, we are part of this world. Just like experience is part of the world. There isn't an absolute distinction between the inner and the outer. And to put it simply, and without addressing the ontological intricacies of either system, both Whitehead and Bergson do not conceive of experience as something epistemological, just to be concerned with knowledge and experience, but as something ontological. And both agree that experience is not to be reduced to human faculty. It's not something just humans do, nor that it is something that is conscious. Experience does not necessarily mean consciousness. Good. The problem that we encounter with this sort of view is that we are absolutely used to conceive of the mind in here and the world out there. We are so well taught by Descartes that there is a res extensa out there and a res cogitans in here, and somehow they never communicate except maybe they touch in one little point, and that's how the whole world appears to us. We've been so well taught by these philosophies that it's really hard to see experience in a different way. But think about it. We thought that we had a completely separate mind that was supposed to disclose a world that it had no access to. How is that going to work? That can't work, can it? So this is, so to say, the general background, and now I want to look at engaged experience in two examples, one in Bergson's intuition and then in Whitehead's causal efficacy. So I'm going to give you two more or less concrete examples of engaged experience. So Bergson's intuition describes an event of engaged experience whose aim is not unmitigated insight into eternal truths, but a direct grasping of concrete singularity, of what is there in the world. Every event of intuition is a simple and indivisible event of experience that allows us to grasp, to experience, or to live an object from within. So this event means that we undergo a fundamental shift in perspective. We move from our position of experience into the position of experience of the object that we're disclosing in intuition. From its own perspective, we perceive its world. To say it in the words of Bergson, I quote, "Intuition is an immediate consciousness, a direct seeing, that is almost identical to the object seen, as well as a type of knowledge that is a form of touching or coinciding, the coincidentia," end quote. So one might now wonder what this is supposed to mean. I mean, it seems obvious to us that a tree is out there. And in my mind, I do have an image of the tree, granted. And the image of the tree is somehow related to the tree, granted. But how are we supposed to enter into the tree? To go out, how's that supposed to work? Again, Husserl can provide us a very interesting first step to get us there. Again, on the level of epistemology, safe ground. So from his earliest writing onwards in the logical investigations, Husserl always argued that it is simply an illusion to think that all we have access to in experience are copies or mere images or mere appearances. This common sense understanding of experience, namely that experience means to have a copy or an image or representation in the mind, he calls the Bildertheorie of experience, so the image theory of cognition. Even though the Bildertheorie has been quite pervasive and throughout the history of philosophy has always had its proponents, according to Husserl, it does not actually describe what happens when we experience. If we take care to look at actual experience and how we actually experience the world, and if we compare that to the experience of an image, the difference is obvious, and it's quite striking. There is a substantial difference between let's say, the experience of an actual cake that I can smell, that I can touch, that I can taste, and the image of a cake that I can see. So to perceive an image has a very different quality than to perceive what there is. And Husserl says if we look at the different qualities, there is an absolute distinction. Simplest example, the quality of being edible. An image does not have the quality of being edible, while the real cake does have that quality that I experience. The difference, he says, is so pronounced that we only rarely confuse the two experiences. And again, as I mentioned before, there might be a really realistic image, or I might be confused, or I might just be dreaming. But just given enough time to investigate that experience, we will soon realize whether we're actually confronting an actual cake or the mere image of a cake. And he says that what we're given in experience as real, which he calls réel gegeben, has a certain set of qualities that he calls fleshy. Things that we experience are given in a fleshy, in a very substantial, a very three-dimensional, a very five senses manner. Whereas images does not have the quality of fleshiness. A dream does not have this quality of fleshiness, if investigated over time. So whatever is given in this Leibhaft, he says, fleshy manner, is not merely an image, but the real thing. So to him, to Husserl, it is quite obvious that when we look at the world, it's not an image, because we can tell when we see images. When we look at the world, we see the actual world and not its copy. We have direct access to what there is. It's really interesting that Bergson discusses similar ideas in Matter and Memory when he introduces his ontology of images. But there's so much intellectual, conceptual background there that I just left it out and used the easier Husserl to get these ideas across. So intuition aims at entering into the concrete singular. I haven't shown that it's possible, but I hope to have shown that we have access to the world. And as soon as we have access, the entering into doesn't sound as strange as it does, as long as we think that we're hidden and locked away into our brains and have no access to the world at all. And as it is interested in the concrete and not the abstract or general, I would claim that intuition can be understood as engaged experience and does not need to be understood as speculation. I wanted to say something about the relationship between intuition and rationality, which I'll leave for time reasons. Just suffice it to say that Bergson is not an anti-rationalist. Rationality and investigation, science and analysis are immensely important. But again, they cannot grasp everything. Things fall through the cracks because they're not relevant for the scientific questions that we're asking. They're not relevant for our aims. But they're still part of reality, and if we want to account for reality, we need to have a way to engage and access them. And Bergson devises his idea of intuition to do precisely that. Good. Now I want to move on to Whitehead's understanding of causal efficacy. And to Whitehead, experience is at the heart of his cosmology of organism, as he calls it. Bless you. To him, there is no experience, no experiential datum that is too insignificant. There is no moment of experience that we do not need to account for if we want to understand what the actual world is like. There is nothing to be overlooked. And there is nothing in the world that does not engage in experience, Whitehead says. So it's adequate to call him a pan-experientialist. Experience is everywhere. But it's important to keep in mind that Whitehead's understanding of experience differs quite substantially from our understanding of experience. Experience does not presuppose consciousness, first. And secondly, experience is a very, very broad concept. Fundamentally, for Whitehead, experience pretty much amounts to any interaction that has an effect on the processes contributing to that interaction. And this, in Whitehead, gets the term experiential togetherness. So in experience, there is a togetherness and an interaction. And I hope that these ideas have become clear with the things that I said about Husserl and Bergson. That there is, in experience, there is an interaction, a correlation. It's not just happening in here. And for Whitehead, one could claim that even causation is a form of experience. One really, really basic form, but it's a form of experience, causation. And what we in modern science call causation is derived from an experience. It is abstracted from that experience, and it's devoid of that concrete lived meaning. But what he's trying to say is that, you know, when I drop things, they fall down. When I engage with things, things happen. So it's an everyday causation is an everyday experience, and a scientist needs to have had that experience before he or she could even develop the theory of causation. So we need to be engaged in all of these experiences before we can abstract them into scientific theories. Again, a way to see how, for Whitehead, there is no opposition between science and philosophy, but that he tries to find a common ground where both can derive from. And this very broad understanding of experience that Whitehead has rests on a leveled understanding of experience. And his idea is that the most fundamental ground of experience is causal efficacy. And causal efficacy, much in analogy to intuition, is a form of immediate grasping, of immediate access, of immediate experience, and bodily affection. So it's something you feel in your body. So when the sun shines and you feel the heat on your body, it's an immediate experience like that. The next higher level for Whitehead is called presentational immediacy. And he says that what appears on this level appears as immediately given. You have no way of tracing it back to its roots. Whereas the causal efficacy points you to something that's having a causal effect on you. Presentational immediacy just presents itself as being immediate. And in perception, both are intertwined. I quote from Whitehead, in sense perception, data from one of the basic modes, and that's usually presentational immediacy, is used to interpret data from the other mode. So for example, I use the round yellow shape that I see, maybe up there, as immediately given. So this round yellow shape seems to be there. There seems to be no becoming of that shape. There seems no genesis. It's just there. And I use that shape to interpret the warmth that I feel on my skin. Having enough background knowledge, I can conclude that I'm feeling the sun, or I'm experiencing the sun. So that's the level of investigation that Whitehead uses. So with the term causal efficacy, Whitehead refers to those aspects in experience that disclose a feeling conformally in and with another. A sympathy, a feeling together. And I quote Whitehead, "The primitive form of physical experience is emotional, blind emotion, received as felt elsewhere in another occasion and conformally appropriated as subjective passion." So I feel it as if I was the other. In the language appropriate to the higher stages of experience, and the language that we usually use to speak, the primitive element is sympathy. That is, feeling the feeling in another and feeling conformally with another. Feelings and blind emotions thus constitute the bedrock of causal efficacy. So for Whitehead, we don't need to distinguish or decide between feelings and intelligence. Feeling is the most basic form of intelligence from which all science, all knowledge, all understanding departs. So there is no position. Just like intuition allows us, as an indivisible event of experience, to enter into the object and grasp it from within, causal efficacy allows us to feel and appropriate as subjective another actual occasion through sympathy. So it's really a grasping of what's out there, because there is no out there that's completely independent from the in here. And both forms of engaged experience allow us to access the dynamic nature of reality alive, and it allows us to access this immediately. However, while Bergson's engaged experience as intuition is a rare event, Whitehead's causal efficacy is the basis of any event of experience. It's always present, even if we don't usually experience it explicitly. So I hope to have shown that there is something to this way of seeing the world, and I hope to have shown that if we grant engaged experience that's engaged in these two ways, there is just a small step to take to understand reality as a life. Thank you.